All righty. Whoa. Let's turn it down a little bit. Okay, well, we have tonight, and then we have 2 more meetings after this. So the semester is flying by, and I wish we had more time to get through all this material, but we don't. So we're going to do the best that we can. Reminder that next Sunday night we are not meeting since it's the weekend of Thanksgiving. So you'll have, again, 2 more weeks to complete the material for the next meeting, and then there'll be 1 meeting after that. And don't quote me on this, but I think we're eating Olive Garden for the last meeting. So, yeah, we're going to go out with a bang. All right, we have a lot to cover tonight. Wisdom literature. Just being fully transparent, this is one of the genres that I feel least adequate to teach, but I'm going to do my best anyways. Some people just love the Proverbs, and they read a proverb a day every month, and they just cycle through it every month, and good for them. That's not me. But as I've been studying wisdom literature this week, I was reminded again that I need to immerse myself in this literature more and more because there is a lot of helpful stuff. So what is wisdom? Well, in a nutshell, wisdom literature explains how one can live well in the fear of the Lord. You'll notice that theme, fear of the Lord, comes up a lot in Proverbs. For example, Proverbs 1, verse 7 says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction." And in 2 other books that are also wisdom literature, Job and Ecclesiastes, they also have this sort of wisdom theme that comes through. Job 28:28. "Behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to turn away from evil is understanding." And then Ecclesiastes 12:13. This is at the end of the book. He says, "The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of man." This is what wisdom literature in Scripture is fundamentally about, living well in the fear of the Lord. How do you experience shalom, as the ancient Jew would say? This human flourishing, this peace that one can experience. How can one live the good life? This is what wisdom literature is all about. Now, as I was just saying, wisdom has a lot to do with one's orientation towards God. It doesn't have a whole lot to do with one's IQ, right? It's not how smart somebody is. It's how one orients his life towards God. That's what true wisdom is all about. And as you were studying wisdom literature this week, it's not this straightforward prose, right? It's not like reading Romans or historical narrative. It requires some thought. It requires some time to meditate on it, to really grasp what is being said. Ben Witherington III, I like what he said here. He said, "Studying wisdom literature requires patience and time, since so much of wisdom literature involves indirect speech, metaphors, similes, figures, images, and riddles, rather than straightforward propositions or normal discourse. One is obligated not merely to read the wisdom material, but also to ruminate upon it." Ruminate upon it. Soak it in, dwell on it, meditate on it. That's how you get the most out of wisdom literature. There's a certain wisdom literature refers to a broad general category, but then there's subsets of wisdom literature, the most famous of which, the one that you probably think of when you hear wisdom literature, is Proverbs. Proverbs is the primary category of wisdom that we tend to think of. It's taken from a Hebrew word here. The term mashal is a broad term. It includes everything from short, pithy statements to lengthy story parables. There's a broad spectrum of what a proverb, a mashal, could be. In fact, when the Greek translators of the Old Testament translated the word mashal, they used the word parabole, which is our word parable. So parable is proverb is a broader spectrum than just these short, pithy statements, but that tends to be what we think of, and that tends to be what Proverbs is filled with the most of. What is a famous proverb, not in the Bible, maybe an American proverb that you can think of? Okay, what does that mean?
It is, rather than risk what you already have at the illusion of more, it's better to actually keep what you have.
Okay. Very good.
Yeah.
All right, another proverb?
Better than what rise makes men believe.
There you go. All right. Now, both of these statements are what we might say wise statements, generally true statements, but not necessarily universal ironclad promises. Like an apple a day keeps the doctor away, right? Like there have been people who eat apples every day who die of a heart attack. But generally speaking, eating healthy is good for you and will help you live a long life. That's really the general idea behind proverbial statements. Proverbs are wisdom from the past that are passed down to the next generation so they know how to live well. So it's concerned with the general order and pattern of living in God's creation. So this is a little different than looking for special revelation from God. Right? In Proverbs, you're not going to get deep doctrinal truths about God or about salvation or anything like that. It's just general wisdom, how to live, especially when God isn't offering new revelation. God isn't speaking directly to you. How do you best deal with the circumstances in front of you when there's no special word from God, so to speak? That's what wisdom is getting after. So I want us to consider the book of Proverbs tonight. We're going to spend most of our time in this book. We're going to spend just a little bit of time in Job and Ecclesiastes. So first of all, I want us to think briefly about the structure of Proverbs. You can really break it down into three categories. So chapters 1 to 9 is this extended general introduction to the rest of the book. Chapter 1, verse 1 begins the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David. And the rest of this section deals a lot with parental exhortations towards their son about fearing the Lord, about fleeing evil, warnings about hanging around the wrong crowd, especially the adulterous woman, exhortations to pursue wisdom, to work hard, this idea of diligently working. This section also speaks of wisdom in a personified way, which we'll get to later. The section contains not necessarily these short, pithy statements, but some poems, some lengthy poems, actually. So chapters 1 to 9 is not this normal proverb that we tend to think of where it's like 2 lines. We'll get to that in a second. When you get to the second section, chapters 10 through 29, this is all 2-liners for the most part. All right? This is where there's a lot of what's called parallelism, which we'll talk about briefly. Chapters 10 to 29 are mostly Proverbs of Solomon, which, by the way, the book of Proverbs is a collection of Proverbs that were collected long after Solomon died. We know that because chapter 25, verse 1, it talks about these are the Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, copied. And Hezekiah came 250 years after Solomon. So Solomon isn't the final compiler of this book. People were taking his Proverbs and they compiled them together into this book. And because he is the one that most of the Proverbs are attributed to, he's often the one that's most closely associated with his book. But there are sections of it that are Proverbs by other people. So, for example, chapter 22, verse 17 to chapter 24, verse 34, these are collected sayings from somebody else. And then also at the very end there, chapters 30 and 31, those are from other people as well. Agur, I don't know if I say that name right, and Lemuel, these are words of them. And this is, again, goes away from the short, pithy statements to lengthy poems. You get the virtuous woman there in chapter 31, which is a lengthy poem. It's actually an acrostic of the Hebrew alphabet. This is the basic breakdown of Proverbs. Now, what I want to do over the next few minutes is I want to give us 6 principles for interpreting Proverbs. And then after that, we're going to look at the different types of Proverbs. So 6 principles, and then there's 9 different types of Proverbs. I know that sounds like a lot. Don't write down everything, all right? Just try your best to follow along. So 6 principles for interpreting Proverbs. Number 1, oftentimes general maxims, not universal promises, as I was just saying. So let me give you some examples. Proverbs 10, verse 3, the Lord does not let the righteous go hungry, but he thwarts the craving of the wicked. Is that a promise? Is that always true? Do the righteous sometimes go hungry? Do the wicked sometimes have full bellies? Right? These are, again, general maxims, not universal promises. Proverbs 22:6, train up a child in the way they should go. Even when he's old, he'll not depart from it. Okay? We all know exceptions to that. We know this is a general maxim, not a universal promise. Or Proverbs 10, verse 4, a slack hand causes poverty, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. Generally, but we all know lazy people who are rich. And we all know hardworking people who are poor. So these are general maxims, not universal truths. Just like an apple a day keeps the doctor away. Proverbs are worded to be memorable, not technically precise. Right? They're memorable, right? They're pithy statements. Number 2, Proverbs are oftentimes situational. Right? Some of your homework, you were to look at Proverbs 26:4 and 26:5 because they say the exact opposite, right? Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself, or answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. It just depends on the situation, right? Again, these are not universal truths. It's situational. Proverbs 27:1, do not boast about tomorrow, for you don't know what a day may bring, right? In other words, don't presume upon the future. You need to focus on today. Okay, well, what about Proverbs 6:6? Go to the ant, O sluggard, consider her ways and be wise. Without having any chief officer or ruler, she prepares her bread in summer and gathers her food in harvest. So in one sense, yeah, you should think about the future. In another sense, you shouldn't, right? It's situational. It depends on the situation. Number 3, know the key words like fool and wise. These are words that are used a lot in Proverbs. Proverbs 1:7, probably the key verse to the entire book. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. A fool does not refer to a dummy. A fool does not refer to someone who's unintelligent or a simpleton. No, a fool is a pagan. A fool is someone who does not fear God and has no spiritual insight. That is a fool. Doesn't mean they're less intelligent. It just means they have no spiritual insight. They are not fearing God. Wisdom is the exact opposite, right? Again, it doesn't mean you're really smart. It doesn't mean you have a high IQ. It just means you do know God. You do have spiritual insight, and you live according to God's rules. You fear God. Number 4, we should try to learn the cultural customs. This is true of any text, right? Sometimes they say things like, what does that mean? Well, if you understand a little bit about the cultural setting, some proverbs make more sense. Proverbs 22:11, he who loves purity of heart and whose speech is gracious will have the king as his friend. Well, we don't really live in the days of kings anymore. But knowing what this is probably saying something like, you will be able to make a positive impression on people who are in high positions, people who are in leadership positions. Or Proverbs 25:24, it's better to live in a corner of the housetop than in a house shared with a quarrelsome wife. I saw you nudging each other over there. I don't know what that's about. Gene, do you see this? Yeah. Well, back then they had flat roofs, right? So it's just helpful to know they had flat roofs that people could stay on. Think of the story like Rahab, right? And the spies coming. They hung out on her roof. Or think about the story where the four men dropped the paralytic down through they go up on the roof, they dug through it, and they lowered him down. Or when you think about the Old Testament law, they were commanded to put a parapet, right? This guardrail or this railing around the fence because people went up there, right? So a modern application, Matt said in our meeting, the bonus room with a TV, right? It's better to live up in the bonus room with a TV than share a wife with a quarrelsome wife. Lori, I don't know what he meant by that, but you could say it's better to live in the garage, or the shed. Proverbs 11:1, a false balance is an abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight. Right? This is addressing shady business practices that used to happen, where they would barter and sell things and trade for goods, and they could rig their scales so it looked like more was on there than really was, and make a greater profit. So useful to know this stuff. He who spares a rod hates his son. Again, you don't have to think about that literally, like I have to use the rod to beat my son, but you could just say whoever spares the spoon, right? Or the belt, as my dad, quoting this verse to me, as if that helped me when I was a child. I love you. Okay, Dad. Of course, what he means here is it's unloving to leave your children uncorrected without consequences for wrongdoing. All right, number 5, look for parallelism. This is what you'll find in most of the Proverbs, especially from chapters 10 through 29. You have this parallelism, which is a normal poetic structure for Hebrew poetry. We'll look at this more in depth in our next meeting when we look at poetry. But there are several types of parallelism, 3 main ones. There's what's called antithetical parallelism, which is when the second line provides a contrast to the first line. That's antithetical parallelism. There's synonymous parallelism, which is the second line says the same thing in other words. And then there's what's called synthetic parallelism, which is where the second line builds upon the first by expanding it or completing it. So let's read through these, and you tell me which type of parallelism, either antithetical, synonymous, or synthetic. So Proverbs 12:6, the words of the wicked lie in wait for blood, but the mouth of the upright delivers them. What kind is that? What kind? Antithetical. All right, Proverbs 15:32, whoever ignores instructions despises himself, but he who listens to reproof gains intelligence. Antithetical. Proverbs 16:4, the Lord has made everything for its purpose, even the wicked for the day of trouble. Synthetic is correct. And then Proverbs 16:11, a just balance and scales are the Lord's. All weights in the bag are his work. Synonymous, yes. So you see this parallel structure. This is all throughout the Proverbs. Number 6, sometimes wisdom is personified. It speaks as if wisdom is a person and has human characteristics. Proverbs 1:20-21, wisdom cries aloud in the street. In the markets, she raises her voice. At the head of the noisy streets, she cries out. At the entrance of the noisy streets, she cries out. Wisdom is often personified as a woman, Sometimes it's called Lady Wisdom elsewhere. Wisdom is also sometimes closely associated with God. Seems to be almost an extension of God himself. So Proverbs 3:19-20, the Lord by wisdom founded the earth. By understanding he established the heavens. By his knowledge the deeps broke open and the clouds dropped the dew. And then Proverbs 8:22-30, the Lord possessed me at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts of old. Ages ago I was set up at the first, before the beginning of the earth. Before mountains had been shaped, before the hills, I was brought forth. When he established the heavens, I was there. When he drew a circle on the face of the deep, when he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside him, like a master workman, and I was daily his delight. Speaking of wisdom, a lot of people look at a proverb like this and see that as a reference perhaps to Christ. Like this is describing Jesus. Thinking to like verses like John 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. So some people have tried to see this text being sort of a possible reference to Christ. All right, so those are just 6 principles to consider when interpreting Proverbs. Now let's consider 9 types of Proverbs. All right, you're going to run out of space. 9 types of Proverbs. The first one, descriptive. Descriptive Proverbs. This is when it's making a statement, a declarative statement. Proverbs 26:13, the sluggard says, there's a lion in the road. There's a lion in the streets. That's an interesting proverb, by the way. I like that proverb. Because it's kind of shocking, actually. Because the sluggard, you would expect the sluggard to say, actually, you might say like the liar says there's a lion in the road, right? Like the deceiver says. But the sluggard is just making an excuse to not get out and work. Right? This is what's going on here. I don't want to work, so yeah, there's a line out there, and if I go out there, I'll die, so I better stay in and do nothing. There you go. Yeah, good luck. Good luck. Here's another just statement, Proverbs 26:16, the sluggard is wiser in his own eyes than 7 men who can answer sensibly. That was descriptive. Next one is prescriptive. This is where there's an exhortation, right? So he's encouraging his listeners to do something. Proverbs 6:6, go to the ant, O sluggard. Consider her ways and be wise. Or Proverbs 6:20, my son, keep your father's commandment and forsake not your mother's teaching. So here's some just exhortations that the sage wants the student or the son to learn. Number 3, comparative. This is where the proverb will say one thing is better than the other. There's a lot of these. Proverbs 17:1, better is a dry morsel with quiet than a house full of feasting with strife. Or Proverbs 8:11, for wisdom is better than jewels, and all that you may desire cannot compare with her. One thing is better than another. You see a good bit of these kinds of proverbs. The next type is contrastive. This is contrasting two things through parallelism. We've already looked at antithetical parallelism, but this is essentially what antithetical parallelism does. It does a lot of contrasting. Proverbs 13:11, wealth gained hastily will dwindle, but whoever gathers little by little will increase it. So they're making a contrast between two different categories of people. And then Proverbs 13:20, whoever walks with the wise becomes wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm. Right? So here's just good wisdom for maybe it's an older person passing along to a younger person, maybe a parent to a child, or what was called a sage. Right? So a sage is a teacher of wisdom. You hear Sometimes we'll use the word sage, like, oh, this really, I don't know how we use it, but sage was a legitimate category for a Jewish wise person who taught and passed along wisdom. So Solomon would have been considered a sage, and others after him would have been considered a sage. So these are sages passing along wisdom. Number 5, numerical, or we might call them staircase proverbs. This is where the second line builds upon the first line that contains numerals. So part of your homework dealt with one of these. But Proverbs does this a decent bit. Again, this is just a poetic literary technique for emphasis. I thought Matt described it well at our table. This is, again, they didn't have punctuation marks like we do. So this was a way to provide exclamation. So Proverbs 30:15, 3 things are never satisfied. 4 never say enough. Or Proverbs 30:21, under 3 things the earth trembles. Under 4 it cannot bear it up. Or Proverbs 6:16, there are 6 things the Lord hates, 7 that are abomination to him. It does seem like he's just trying to drive the point home with a little more oomph by doing this. Number 6, riddles. These are word puzzles, if you will, that test wisdom. It's interesting, Proverbs 1:6 says, to understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. So it was understood that the sage was giving riddles that required the listener to contemplate, to try and make sense of what he was saying. As also Proverbs 25:2 says, it is the glory of God to conceal things, but the glory of kings is to search things out, to solve the riddles. A couple examples of some riddle-like language. Proverbs 30:18 and 19. 3 things are too wonderful for me. 4 I do not understand. There you see that numerical staircase. The way of an eagle in the sky, the way of a serpent on a rock, the way of a ship on the high seas, and the way of a man with a virgin. Or Proverbs 26:1-2. Like snow in summer or rain in harvest, so honor is not fitting for a fool. Like a sparrow in its flitting, like a swallow in its flying, a curse that is causeless does not alight. Number 7, we have beatitudes. Of course, if you read the Gospels, you're familiar with what a beatitude is. Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Right? Jesus gave beatitudes, but so did sages. So did the people who gave Proverbs. Proverbs 8:32, and now, O sons, listen to me. Blessed are those who keep my ways. Or Proverbs 3:13, blessed is the one who finds wisdom and the one who gets understanding. Or Proverbs 28:14, blessed is the one who fears the Lord always, but whoever hardens his heart will fall into calamity. Number 7, that was 7. Number 8, parabolic. Like I said, the word mashal is translated into the Greek as parabole, which is where we get our word parable from. So we find parables in the Proverbs. This is figurative speech that points beyond itself. I think specifically of the shorter parables that Jesus gave. Remember a few weeks ago, I gave you a few different categories of parables, and one was called a similitude. These were the short ones where it was just a comparison using like or as. For example, Jesus says, the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure that's hidden in a field. That when a man finds it, he buries it, and he goes and sells all he has and buys the field. You see a lot of that kind of language in the Proverbs. So Proverbs 4:18, but the path of the righteous is like the dawn of light, which shines brighter and brighter until full day. Or Proverbs 4:19, the way of the wicked is like deep darkness. They do not know over what they stumble. Or Proverbs 16:24, gracious words are like a honeycomb, sweetness to the soul and health to the body. And then number 9, narratives. There's proverbs that use more of a story form. They're not quite historical narrative, but they're still giving a close resemblance of a narrative, if you will. The ending of Proverbs, you have the virtuous woman. You have a long section in Proverbs 9 about the way of wisdom, and then also the way of folly that follows it. So there's all kinds of different categories, and they're all trying to do something a little bit differently, right? So we shouldn't look at all the Proverbs and say they're all the exact same, right? They're not all just short, pithy statements that give general truths. They're not all like that. There's a lot like that, but they're not all like that. So it's just helpful to know there's different types of Proverbs that we should be looking for when we read through the Proverbs. All right, now let's move on briefly to the book of Job. Like I said, Job is also often considered wisdom literature. People will say Proverbs are sayings, wisdom sayings, whereas Job and Ecclesiastes are more like the ways of wisdom. Not necessarily statements, like short statements that Proverbs has, but it just has this theme of wisdom throughout. Job's an interesting book. I have to be honest with you, this is one of my least favorite books in the Bible to read. First of all, I have to be honest with you, I hate poetry. Okay, I don't do well with poetry. Just tell me the facts. Give it to me straight. Okay, that's me. And Job, which, by the way, I love the first 2 chapters of Job, although it's a very depressing story, but it's like, hey, I can follow this story, right? It's a terrible story, but you all know it. Job, he's this rich guy, big family, and Satan goes to God and says he only fears you and loves you because you give him nice things, and God gives him permission to take it all away, and he does. And then for the bulk of the book, it's long poems of Job and his friends. And there's these long discourses back and forth. One writer, Craig Bartholomew, says, with the book of Job, he says it's like moving from English at 8th grade level, that's chapters 1 to 2, to the English of Shakespeare, and then back again, because it ends again with prose narrative in the closing. So, yes, Job has all these long speeches, this dialogue back and forth between Job and his friends, and then finally the Lord. I like that part at the end where the Lord speaks, and essentially Job's wanting to know, why, Lord? And the Lord never tells him. He just reminds him of who he is. Where were you, Job, when I formed the earth? Right? So there's this tension, right? There's this tension with the book of Proverbs, actually, in the book of Job. Because what we find with Job's friends, as they're interrogating Job, for lack of a better term, is they are oftentimes applying Proverbs as if they're universal truths. So, for example, one of his friends named Bildad, in Job 8, verse 6, he says to Job, "If you are pure and upright, surely then he will rouse himself for you and restore your rightful habitation." That's basically quoting a proverb to him. Like, this is generally true. Like, you do the right thing and God's favor will come upon you. Yeah, generally speaking. But that's not a universal promise. That's not an ironclad promise. And what Bildad is doing here is he's taking a proverb and he's making it a universal promise. And he's saying, Job, you must have done something wrong. Why else would God be punishing you at this moment? Here's one of his other friends in Job 22. He says, "Is not your evil abundant? There is no end to your iniquities. For you have exacted pledges of your brothers for nothing and stripped the naked of their clothing. Again, all this bad stuff that's happened to you, Job, it must be because you've done bad stuff and God is judging you for it. Again, his friends are taking Proverbs, general statements, and making them universal, ironclad promises from God. That's what they're doing here. Craig Bartholomew again says, there's much to commend in the words of Job's friends. Some of them are nearly verbatim maxims from the book of Proverbs. In the final analysis, though, their positions are misguided. The right words at the wrong time. The right words at the wrong time. Bartholomew goes on to say, like us, Job does not need to know more. Rather, he needs to learn a humble and yet intimate relationship with God that enables him to embrace his creatureliness. This is it. Job wanted to know more, and God never gave him that. So the challenge for Job, and of course for us as we read something like Job, is will we just trust the Lord? When the normal order of things isn't working out. Like, God, I've done all the right things. I've abided by the Proverbs. I've been reading these every day, and I've been living by them, and now all of a sudden all this suffering happens to me. This doesn't add up. It's this sort of topsy-turvy wisdom, if you will. That's what Job seems to be getting at. And then finally we have Ecclesiastes. Again, a little bit about the structure there. You have a frame. Boy, I type these so fast, not frame. Frame narratives on the front end and on the back. And then you have this person, Kohelet, which depending on which translation you read, sometimes he is the compiler, the preacher. I don't know what other translations say. But he's on this exploration on the meaning of life. He's in search of deep existential questions. What is all of this about? It's really an autobiographical quest for that, the real meaning of life. And again, this seems to be almost a counterbalance to the book of Proverbs. Proverbs is essentially reflecting views of the traditional way of things and how things ordinarily ought to work, and Ecclesiastes seems to be offering the counter order. And so this person feels as if life is meaningless. You'll see the phrases frequently throughout this book, vanity of vanities. Or you'll see this phrase, under the sun, used a whole bunch. Let me give you a couple examples here. Of chapter 1, verse 14, he says, I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and a striving after wind. And then the next couple verses, I said in my heart, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me. And my heart has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge, and I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceive that this also is but a striving after wind. Again, this seems to be a sort of counter order to Proverbs. He's saying, listen, I pursued all this wisdom, and I still feel like life is missing something. Life just feels meaningless. There's this existential struggle that he is dealing with. Ben Witherington says here, Koheleth stands at the ragged edge of a world gone wrong and sees it for what it is, a wisdom philosophy under such circumstances, especially if there is suffering, persecution, oppression, and poverty, is frankly inadequate. And this book proves it. However accurate certain maxims may be under certain limited good circumstances. There's a bit of discussion in the literature that Proverbs is geared more for upper class individuals. Like this is coming from the king to people who are in kingly circles or well-to-do circles. And Ecclesiastes is maybe more for the person who doesn't have the same sort of benefits or privileges as the people in higher ups. And so it's offering wisdom to that sort of lower class of people. I don't know what to think about that, but I just thought that was interesting as I was reading it. I will say, though, that at the end of Ecclesiastes, it does have this nice ending to it, where even though he's gone on for 12 chapters about his struggles through life, he does end this way, verse 13 and 14, the end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. So he still, at the end, acknowledges that God is sovereign, that even though life feels meaningless, it's not. Our feelings shouldn't trump truth, that God is on the throne. He's going to be the righteous judge at the end. And so do what's right. Finally, let's consider Jesus, the sage. Of course, I hope as we were going through a lot of this, you were thinking of Jesus. Some of these things that, especially in Proverbs or even Ecclesiastes, sounds a lot like Jesus. Jesus taught in parables, mashal, right? Meshalim. He taught in these. That was one of his primary methods of teaching. Of course, he taught in Beatitudes. He taught in narratives. He taught in riddles. Here are just some examples of pithy statements, proverbial statements that Jesus makes. And I could have picked like dozens more. Mark 10:31. But many who are first will be last, and the last first. Pithy, memorable. But what's interesting is it's wisdom of a counter order. It's a bit of an ironic wisdom. This is not like Proverbs. Proverbs, if you're not careful, you can come away with a sort of prosperity gospel theology. You work hard, you honor God, and you will be rich and wealthy, and everything will go great for you. If all you read was Proverbs, you could maybe come away with that sort of theology. Jesus, though, has this sort of counterfactual, topsy-turvy wisdom, right? The last will be first, and the first last. Or Mark 8:35, for whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. Again, it's this sort of upside-down, topsy-turvy wisdom. I can't quite tell if Jesus has more in common with Proverbs or Ecclesiastes. Right? He doesn't quite fit the mold of either one, right? But there's a little bit of each in his teachings. And then Matthew 6:24, no one can serve two masters, for he will either hate the one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. So Jesus comes as this sage, this teacher of wisdom. He is the new and better Solomon. He's the new and better son of David. As Jesus says in Matthew 12:42, he said, the queen of the south will rise up at the judgment of this generation and condemn it. For she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and behold, something greater than Solomon is here. Someone greater than Solomon is here. Ben Witherington, again, he says, by even a conservative estimate, at least 70% of Jesus' tradition is in the form of some sort of wisdom utterance, such as an aphorism, which is just a short, pithy statement, a riddle, or a parable. At least 70%. Jesus is this sage. He's a teacher of wisdom. He is the new and better Solomon. But he's not just that. Jesus is true wisdom himself. He's the sage, but he's also wisdom incarnate. One of the most well-known verses in Matthew 11:28-30. Jesus says, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Such a beautiful expression by Jesus. And Zach's going to get really excited about this next one, because I'm quoting Sirach, which is, of course, Second Temple Judaism literature. This is from the intertestamental period. Sirach is essentially a book that's very similar to Proverbs. It was written in between the Old and the New Testaments. And Ben Sira, who's the writer of this, he's viewed as a sage, much like Solomon in the book of Proverbs. I want you to read carefully what Ben Sira wrote here, and then we're going to reflect back on what Jesus said there in Matthew 11. So Sirach 6:23 and following says, "Put your feet into wisdom's fetters, and your neck into her collar. Bend your shoulders and carry her. Come to her with all your soul, for at last you will find the rest that wisdom gives. Her yoke is a golden ornament, and her bonds a purple cord." So here's this sage, this Jewish sage, about 200 years before Jesus, who is speaking of wisdom as if it's a yoke that people needed to put upon themselves. And when they do, they will find rest for themselves. No doubt in my mind that Jesus had this text in mind when he said the words of Matthew 11:28-30. Again, the Apocrypha is not in the Bible, but it was common Jewish literature that normal Jews would have been pretty familiar with. Like we might be familiar with Tim Keller's writings or John Piper's writings or something like that. Here's Jesus in Matthew 11 saying, "I am that wisdom. Take me on as a yoke, and you'll find rest for your souls." Jesus is the fulfillment of not just sages, but of wisdom itself. Remember in Proverbs, we saw instances where wisdom was personified, and it was closely associated with God. Wisdom was there at the foundations of the earth, and it existed before creation, which, there's a reason why people have looked at those texts and thought, I wonder if that is referring to Jesus, because it really does sound a lot like Jesus. So here at the end, I said here, just like Jesus is both priest and sacrifice, both prophet and the word, he is both sage and wisdom itself. And we got done 9 minutes early. So do you have any questions?
I feel like we should ask you a question on Job.
Of course.
You said you love
I'm assuming that I don't read it very often, as much as I should.
Is it a parable or is it a true story? And then what is it?
Yeah. We don't know. That's such a hard question. We don't know who wrote it. We don't know when it was written. There's no reference to anything Jewish, like nothing about the Torah or Moses or Mount Sinai or the Exodus or anything like that. We don't have any idea where Uz is. He's from the land of Uz. So, to answer your question, I'm not quite sure. Again, I haven't studied this book super in depth. I admit that. So, I'm not quite sure. I mean, you have New Testament characters like James. He refers to the patience of Job. So maybe he thinks he's a historical character, but maybe he's just referring to like how we might refer to Bilbo Baggins, you know. I don't know. I just haven't studied enough to give you a great answer for if this is just a long, extended parable or if this is a real guy. If he is a real guy, he seems to have existed sometime like pre-Exodus, like maybe in the patriarchal era of like Abraham living in a different land, and he had some kind of relationship with God. But does somebody else have a better answer for that?
Is it the Chaldeans that come in?
Chaldeans mentioned, yes. So those would be like Babylonian people. So that might suggest a historical nature to the book.
We actually talked about the same thing in our table. Like, would anything be lost if it is a parable?
I don't think so. I do think, I just want to be careful because we want to treat God's word with like reverence. And if this is a true story, we wouldn't want to say, oh, it's just a parable. And then, of course, there's like a slippery slope fallacy. Well, if this is a parable, well, maybe the Exodus is a parable. And maybe Jonah really was a parable and not a real story. So I would definitely want to be very cautious of something like that. But I don't think so. Like I don't think, like, for example, if Job was somehow removed from the Bible, we would miss out on like suffering. Like there's obviously some wisdom there on suffering and understanding that sometimes we just don't know why we suffer and why God allows it. So there's some really helpful stuff there. But I don't know if we depend on Job for any doctrine or specific Christian belief. It's a tough question. I'm going to say 51% I kind of think he was a real guy.
We read Proverbs 31 as a list of things that a virtuous woman today should look at? Or is that referring to wisdom personified or something else?
I don't know. Ladies, what do you think? Is Proverbs 31, like, is that your litmus test, or... Again, like I want to treat it almost like what I was saying, like these are general observations or general statements. So does every virtuous woman have to look just like that? No, definitely not. There you go. She's That's right. That was a wise statement. Yeah.
Maybe a quick question.
Yep.
In Proverbs, right, like there's one chapter that talks about women and the rest are speaking of men and sons. Is that one of those kind of like, sure they're saying men and sons, but that can apply to everybody? Like flip-flop back and forth, even the quarrelsome wife, would you flip-flop that be a quarrelsome husband, or is that, don't want to flip-flop too?
You know, it's definitely an androcentric culture and book. So it's a father writing to a son, a lot of it. But I would say absolutely, it's just as applicable to females in every way. So yeah, don't hang out with the adulterous man. Got it? Good.
I did a quick search here. So this goes back to the date of Job. There's other ancient Near Eastern literature, Sumerian, Akkadian, that 2200 BC, 19th century BC, 2nd millennium BC, things like that. So maybe it can be dated as far as when it was written close to it.
So, like Abraham's time, which is around 2000, BC. So yeah, if it is like referring to a real situation, I would say that's probably when. Because again, it's not talking about anything Jewish, right? There's nothing about the law or. But all cultures kind of did sacrifices.
Yeah, it doesn't seem specific to the Levitical sacrifices. Could be pre-Noah.
It could be. Yeah, I just have no idea.
Not knowing
Yeah, that's true. If one of you has more insight on that, feel free to share it with me. I think Zach, you apparently have studied this book a lot and like it a lot more than I do. So
A lot.
yeah. One day I'll preach through it, and then I'll be forced to really learn it. That's why I preached Leviticus last summer. I was like, I just need to force myself to know this book. And so I preached it. And I was like, they're all going to have to suffer through it with me. Yes, Kurt.
Well, I just bring down the Joe thing again. When you're talking about this general knowledge that these three friends had about God, so where did they get this general knowledge from?
Yeah, I don't know.
We were thinking about general knowledge, like thinking about common grace. We can look at things that are outside, the people that are non-believers, and they speak wisdom. And I think you hit that as earlier, things that are passed down as patterns, of living that lead to human flourishing. So you could make an argument that these other wisdom literatures that are out there, that are parallel to Proverbs, Job, things like that. It's just a reflection of God's common grace and a pattern of living that leads to human flourishing.
Yeah, there's a lot of Egyptian wisdom literature. Remember who Solomon's first wife was? The daughter of Pharaoh. And there's a lot of parallels with some Egyptian wisdom literature and some of the Proverbs.
Before the book of Proverbs, the Egyptian.
Right. It's 7:00, so go relieve the child care people of their duties. Enjoy your Thanksgiving, everybody.